You are Catherine Whitmore, and the rough hemp rope around your waist scratches against your worn cotton dress as your husband James adjusts his grip on the other end. The cobblestones of Wakefield Market Square are slick with morning dew, and your breath creates small puffs of vapor in the October air of 1834. Round you, the familiar sounds of market day, the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the haggling voices of farmers, create a backdrop that would be comforting, if not for the knot of terror in your stomach. But today you are not here to buy bread or sell eggs. Today, you are the merchandise. Step up here, Catherine, James says, not unkindly, gesturing to a wooden crate that will serve as your platform. His voice carries the weight of resignation rather than cruelty. This morning he drank 3 pints of ale to steady his nerves, and his hands shake slightly as he helps you onto the makeshift stage. The crowd is already gathering, farmers returning from the cattle pens, housewives pausing in their mourning, shopping, children drawn by the promise of spectacle. You scan their faces, looking for John Hartwell, the blacksmith who has been visiting you in secret for months, who promised he would be here, who represents your only hope of escape from a marriage that has become a slow death by starvation and neglect. What am I bid for this fine woman? James calls out, his voice carrying across the square with practiced authority. 28 years old, strong as an ox, can spin and weave, bear children, and cook a meal fit for a king. Never been sick a day in her life, and look at these hands, not afraid of honest work. He lifts your arm to display your calloused palms to the crowd like a horse trader, showing off a mare's legs. The humiliation burns in your chest, but beneath it lies something else, a desperate hope that this degradation will purchase your freedom. The legal reality that has brought you to this moment stretches back centuries, codified in English, common law, and crystallized in the writings of Sir William Blackstone. When you married James Whitmore 7 years ago, you ceased to exist as a legal person. The doctrine of coverture, as ancient as it was absolute, declared that the very being, or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is consolidated and incorporated into that of the husband. You became what the law termed a feme covert, a covered woman, hidden beneath your husband's legal identity as completely as if you wore an invisibility cloak. Before marriage, you had been Catherine Mills, a spinner who could sign your own name and owned your grandmother's silver thimble. You could enter contracts, own property, and even bring lawsuits. But the moment the church bells rang to celebrate your wedding, everything changed. Your wages from spinning became James's property. The small inheritance from your aunt, £3 in a wooden chest, transferred automatically to your husband. Even the shoes on your feet, the ribbons in your hair, the very dress you wore to your wedding, all became his legal possessions. If James chose to sell these items, you had no recourse. If he spent your earnings on gin and cards, the law supported his right as head of household. The system offered women like you no escape routes. Divorce existed, but only for the wealthy. Before 1857, obtaining a divorce required a private act of Parliament, a process so expensive and complex that it cost at least £1,000, more money than most working families would see in 10 lifetimes. Even after the Matrimonial Causes Act made divorce slightly more accessible through the courts, it still cost around £40, more than a laborer's annual wages. For working-class women trapped in violent or unbearable marriages, the law offered exactly 5 options: mutual separation without the right to remarry, desertion and a life of hiding, legal separation through church courts that didn't permit remarriage, death, or the grotesque theater of wife selling. 2 shillings, calls out a voice from the crowd. The bidder is a young farmer you don't recognize. His face flushed with excitement or embarrassment. James shakes his head dismissively. Come now, gentlemen, she's worth more than a decent meal. Look at her, strong hips for bearing sons, gentle disposition, never raises her voice or argues. She's brought me 7 years of faithful service, and she'll do the same for her new master. The word master makes your stomach lurch, but it's legally accurate. English law recognized several forms of property, and wives fell clearly into the category of chattels, movable goods like furniture or livestock. The halter round your waist isn't merely symbolic. It represents the legal reality of your status. If a man could own a woman as completely as he owned his plow or his horse, then logically, that property could be transferred to another owner. The practice of wife selling emerged in the late 17th century from this collision between desperate circumstances and rigid law. Unable to afford legal divorce, the poor created their own form of rough justice. The ritual that developed was both deeply humiliating and strangely dignified, a grotesque parody of both divorce and marriage wrapped into one public ceremony. The marketplace setting was crucial. These were spaces where property changed hands, where the community gathered to witness transactions, where handshake deals carried the force of law. By conducting wife sales in these public commercial spaces, participants were demanding that their community recognize and validate what formal law refused to acknowledge. 3 shillings, and I'll take good care of her, offers an older man. You recognize as Robert Fletcher, a widowed miller from the next village. He's not unkind, but his first wife died in childbirth, and you know he needs someone to help raise his 3 young children. Your heart pounds as you search the crowd for John Hartwell's familiar figure. Where is he? The plan was simple. He would outbid anyone else. The money James received would help him start fresh somewhere else, and you would finally escape a marriage that had become a prison of poverty and neglect. The newspaper advertisements that announced these sales read like livestock auctions, and the similarity was intentional. Henry Wilson will dispose of his wife Martha at Doncaster Market on Wednesday next. She is in good health, of sober habits, and can wash, cook, and mind children. No unreasonable offer will be refused. Sometimes the advertisements were more personal. Thomas Green, being tired of domestic discord, will sell his wife Ellen to any person willing to take her off his hands. She is skilled in needlework and has a pleasant disposition when properly treated, but the historical record reveals something crucial that transforms our understanding of these scenes. In most documented cases, the sale was arranged in advance. The buyer was often the woman's lover, and the entire ceremony was a form of consensual divorce and remarriage conducted in the only way working-class people could afford. The humiliation was real, but it served a purpose. It made the separation publicly witnessed and, in the minds of participants, legally binding. For shillings, the voice comes from the back of the crowd, and your heart leaps with relief. John Hartwell pushes through the gathered spectators, his leather apron still stained with soot from his forge. He's a big man with gentle hands, and in the months since your husband lost his job at the mill, John has been your only source of kindness. He's brought you food when James spent their relief money on ale, and he's offered you something you'd almost forgotten existed, hope for a different kind of life. The crowd murmurs with interest. They recognize John, know him as an honest tradesman who pays his debts and treats his apprentices fairly. More importantly, they can see the way. You look at him with relief rather than fear. This isn't a random auction where a desperate woman might end up with a cruel stranger. This is community theater, a public ceremony to legitimize a relationship that already exists. 4 and 6pence, counters Robert Fletcher, but without much conviction. He can see the way the wind is blowing, and he's too decent a man to force himself on a woman who clearly prefers another. The crowd is beginning to sense the predetermined nature of this auction, and their mood shifts from entertainment to approval. They understand that they're witnessing not a crude transaction, but a desperate attempt to solve an impossible problem within the constraints of an unforgiving legal system. James looks around the crowd, waiting to see if any other bids emerge. The silence stretches out, broken only by the sound of a church bell tolling 9 o'clock. Going once for 4 and 6pence, he calls out, his voice carrying a note of finality. Going twice, sold to John Hartwell for 4 shillings and 6pence, and may God bless them both. The crowd applauds as if they've witnessed a satisfying conclusion to a dramatic performance, which in many ways they have. John steps forward with coins he's borrowed from 3 different neighbors, his face flushed with a mixture of relief and embarrassment. The halter is formally transferred from husband to new owner, though John immediately loosens it and lets it fall to your waist. The symbolism is clear. Your legal ownership has been transferred, but your new master intends to treat you with more dignity than the law requires. But even as relief floods through you, the harsh reality remains unchanged. You have simply traded one form of legal slavery for another. If John Hartwell proves to be cruel, if he becomes a drunkard, if he decides to beat you or sell you to someone else, you will have no more legal recourse than you had with James. You have gained a kinder master, but you remain a possession. The crowd may have witnessed what they consider a happy ending, but the fundamental injustice of your situation remains unchanged. The practice of wife selling reveals the profound failure of English legal system to address human needs. Consider the case of Margaret Foster, sold in Halifax market in 1832 for 3 shillings and ninepence to a man identified only as William the Weaver. The newspaper account describes her as a comely young woman of industrious habits who was led to market by her husband after he discovered her relationship with William. What the dry newspaper language conceals is a story of 3 people trying to solve an impossible problem. Margaret's husband, an unemployed stonemason, needed money and wanted to be rid of a wife he could no longer support. Margaret wanted to escape a marriage that had become unbearable. William wanted to legitimize a relationship that already existed. Wife selling offered all 3 parties what they needed in a way that no legal remedy could provide. The prices paid for wives varied enormously, from a high of £100 plus £25 for each child to as little as a pint of ale. Most sales fell between 2 shillings and 5 shillings, roughly equivalent to £20 to 50 in today's money. But the money was never really the point. What mattered was the public nature of the transaction, witnessed by dozens or sometimes hundreds of people who could later testify that the woman had been legally transferred from one man to another. The ritual often included the drawing up of bills of sale, formal documents that used language borrowed from property law. James Whitmore, in consideration of the sum of 4 shillings and 6pence, do sell, assign, and transfer unto John Hartwell, Catherine Whitmore, my wife, with all her rights, properties, claims, and demands whatsoever, to have and to hold. During the term of her natural life, these documents had no legal validity, but they served a psychological purpose for all parties involved. They created the illusion of legitimacy where none existed. The ceremony typically ended with all parties repairing to the nearest public house for what amounted to a wedding feast, paid for by the new husband. Church bells might even ring, as they did in one documented case from 1829 in Ripon, where the entire village treated the wife sale as a cause for celebration. The community, starved for entertainment and drama, transformed these occasions into public festivals that combined elements of theater, legal proceeding, and carnival. But not every wife sale followed this consensual pattern. Some were genuine auctions where women found themselves bid upon by strangers. In March 1768, a carpenter named Edmund Parker from Southwark sold his wife during what the newspapers described as a fit of conjugal indifference. When he sobered up the next morning and begged her to return, she refused, saying she preferred her new situation. Parker hanged himself from a beam in his workshop, leaving behind a note that read simply, "She was all I had in the world." The tragedy illustrates the dangerous emotional undertows that could complicate what participants hoped would be clean, practical transactions. In 1825, a more complex case unfolded in Manchester that reveals the agency women could exercise within this degrading system. A wife named Isabel Thornton was initially sold for 5 shillings to a stranger, but she refused to accompany him, declaring loudly that she wouldn't go with a man who looked like he'd beat his dog. The crowd murmured approval, and she was put up for auction again. This time she was purchased for 3 shillings and a quart of ale by a man she found more suitable. The incident demonstrates that even within the confines of this humiliating practice, women retain some power to shape their own fate. The geographic distribution of wife selling tells us much about the social and economic conditions that made the practice seem necessary. Yorkshire, with its combination of industrial towns and rural poverty, recorded the highest number of cases. 47 out of the 218 documented Victorian-era wife sales. The practice was less common in the prosperous southern counties and almost unknown in Scotland, where different legal traditions, provided alternative remedies for marital breakdown. The industrial transformation of northern England created particularly harsh conditions for working-class marriages. Traditional family economies, where husband and wife worked together as agricultural laborers or in cottage industries, were disrupted by factory employment. Husbands and wives might work different shifts in different industries for different masters. They developed separate social circles and sometimes found themselves living essentially separate lives while still legally bound together. When these marriages failed under the pressure of industrial change, traditional remedies like family intervention or community pressure were less available. The children of these transactions occupied a particularly tragic position in these arrangements. Sometimes they were included in the sale price, like accessories to a main purchase. A woman named Dorothy Mills was sold in Pontefract in 1849, along with her 2 young sons, with the buyer agreeing to take responsibility for their upbringing and apprenticeships. But more often, children were left behind with their fathers, separated from their mothers by transactions they were too young to understand. The emotional trauma inflicted on these children appears rarely in historical records, but we can imagine the psychological damage caused by watching a parent led away with a rope around her neck by a stranger who had just purchased her. Some children never saw their mothers again. Others were reunited years later under circumstances that must have been intensely awkward for everyone involved. In one documented case from 1834, a woman sold in Doncaster encountered her teenage daughter 15 years later. The daughter had grown up believing her mother was dead. The reunion, witnessed by several neighbors, was described in a letter as more painful than joyful for all concerned. The symbolic power of the halter cannot be overstated. Made usually of rope but sometimes of ribbon in a pathetic attempt at dignity, it marked the woman as property to be transferred, no different from a horse or cow. The moment when the halter was removed often marked the woman's psychological transition from one household to another. Some women kept their halters as mementos of their liberation, while others burned them in deliberate acts of symbolic destruction. The most elaborate sales could draw enormous crowds and generate significant local excitement. In December 1851, when a man named Arthur Clayton discovered that his wife had been conducting an affair with a traveling tinker, he tracked the couple down and arranged a public sale that drew nearly 1,000 spectators to the marketplace in Skipton. The local newspaper described the event as combining the solemnity of a legal proceeding with the festive atmosphere of a country fair. Clayton's wife, described as a handsome woman of perhaps 30 years, was sold to her lover for 6 shillings, after what the paper termed spirited bidding from several quarters. Before departing with her new partner, she delivered a short speech to the crowd, thanking them for their witness and declaring herself well pleased with the bargain. The authorities' response to wife selling was inconsistent and often confused. Legally, the practice had no basis whatsoever. It was essentially a public conspiracy to commit adultery, followed by bigamy when the new couples inevitably married. But many local officials seemed genuinely uncertain about their authority to intervene. In 1821, when a magistrate in Ashburn tried to prevent a sale, he was pelted with vegetables and driven away by an angry crowd. Later, he confessed his uncertainty as to the act of selling itself. I do not think I have a right to prevent it, because it rests upon a custom preserved by the people, and it would perhaps be dangerous to deprive them of it by any sudden legal intervention. Some local officials actually encouraged the practice. Poor law commissioners, responsible for maintaining destitute families in workhouses, sometimes compelled husbands to sell their wives, rather than have the parish support separated families. In 1816, Henry Crawford was forced by the Effingham workhouse authorities to sell his wife rather than have the local parish maintain her and her 3 children. She was taken to Godalming Market and sold for 18 pence, with the parish paying for both the journey and a celebratory dinner afterward. The practice began to decline in the 1840s. As social attitudes shifted and legal divorce became marginally more accessible, newspaper coverage grew increasingly critical, describing sales as revolting exhibitions and brutal spectacles. The rising middle class, increasingly uncomfortable with public displays of working-class marital breakdown, pushed for prosecutions. Religious revival movements also worked to suppress the custom, with Methodist and Baptist preachers regularly condemning it from their pulpits. By the 1860s, most sales were conducted privately, with formal deeds drawn up in lawyers' offices rather than public auctions in marketplaces. Participants tried to maintain the legal fiction while avoiding public shame. The last recorded wife sale in England took place in 1913, when a woman giving evidence in a Leeds police court claimed she had been sold to one of her husband's workmates for £1. By then, the practice was widely seen as a relic of a more barbarous age, kept alive more by desperation and tradition than by any belief in its legitimacy. The international dimension of wife selling also shaped its eventual suppression. Foreign observers, particularly the French, seized upon the practice as evidence of British barbarism and moral corruption. French newspapers regularly reported on English wife sales, often exaggerating details for dramatic effect. Political cartoons showed John Bull leading his wife to market like livestock, using the practice as a symbol of English brutality and excessive commercialism. This international ridicule was deeply embarrassing to English elites trying to position Britain as the leader of European civilization and moral progress. The role of alcohol in wife selling cannot be overlooked. Many sales began in taverns, fueled by drink and male camaraderie that made the degradation of women seem acceptable, or even amusing. The ritual often ended with all parties drinking together to celebrate the transaction, a practice that helped normalize what might otherwise seem shocking. But alcohol also provided a convenient excuse for men who later regretted their actions. Several documented cases involve husbands who sold their wives while drunk and then tried to reclaim them when sober, though the legal system generally refused to recognize these post-sale regrets. The economic dimensions of wife selling become clearer when examined alongside other forms of working-class survival strategies. In communities where unemployment was chronic and wages barely sufficient for survival, marriage was often more economic necessity than romantic choice. Women needed male protection and financial support. Men needed domestic labor and child care. When these economic partnerships failed, wife selling provided a way to rearrange resources and responsibilities without the catastrophic loss that desertion or separation would entail. The prices paid reflected these economic calculations. Women, described as good workers or skilled in valuable trades like brewing or cheese-making, commanded higher prices than those whose labor was less marketable. Age, health, and childbearing capacity all affected market value. The haggling that surrounded these sales reveals that participants understood exactly what they were buying and selling, not just a woman, but her labor, her fertility, her domestic skills, and her earning potential. But perhaps the most significant aspect of wife selling was what it revealed about working-class attitudes toward marriage and personal autonomy. These weren't savage customs practiced by barbarians. They were rational responses by desperate people trapped in an irrational system. When formal law offers no remedy for intolerable situations, people create their own forms of rough justice, however grotesque or morally compromised. The women who participated in wife selling weren't simply passive victims of male cruelty and legal oppression, though they were certainly both. They were also active agents trying to improve their circumstances with the limited tools available to them. Some, like Catherine Whitmore standing on that wooden crate in Wakefield Marketplace, successfully used the degrading theater of wife selling to escape abusive marriages and find genuine happiness with more suitable partners. Others discovered that changing masters didn't fundamentally alter the nature of their enslavement, but all of them demonstrated a form of courage that deserves recognition. The courage to endure public humiliation in pursuit of a better life, to risk an unknown future rather than accept a miserable present, to claim whatever small measure of agency the law allowed them. The crowds that gathered to witness these sales weren't simply seeking entertainment, though entertainment was certainly part of the appeal. They were participating in a form of community justice, a way of collectively addressing problems that individual families couldn't solve alone. They were serving as witnesses to transactions that had no legal validity, but acquired moral force through public recognition. The practice also reveals the profound importance of public ritual in working-class communities. These elaborate ceremonies, the marketplace setting, the symbolic halter, the formal bills of sale, the celebratory drinking, weren't just theatrical flourishes. They were desperate attempts to create legitimacy and permanence in relationships that the law refused to recognize. They were ways of transforming what might otherwise be seen as adultery and abandonment into something resembling divorce and remarriage. As we follow Catherine Whitmore walking away from the marketplace with John Hartwell, her former halter now tucked safely in his pocket as proof of legal transfer, we see both the horror and the hope embedded in this grotesque practice. She has escaped one form of oppression by submitting to public humiliation, traded one master for another in the hope that her new owner will treat her with greater kindness and respect. The church bells of Wakefield ring out across the marketplace. As the crowd disperses, some heading to the tavern to toast the new couple, others returning to their own struggles and compromises. The cobblestones are slick with spilled ale and market refuse, and the morning mist is finally burning off to reveal a harsh October sun. Catherine's story, like those of thousands of other women who stood in similar marketplaces with ropes around their necks, reminds us that progress isn't inevitable, that the rights we take for granted were purchased with immense suffering, and that behind every historical practice, however repugnant it may seem to modern eyes, are human beings trying to survive, to find love, to create meaning in circumstances that offer few good choices. The halters are gone now. The marketplaces have been converted to shopping centers, and the legal systems that once treated women as chattel have been reformed. But the fundamental questions raised by wife selling remain as urgent today as they were centuries ago. What happens when legal systems fail to provide adequate remedies for human suffering? How do we balance individual freedom with social stability? What price are we willing to pay for the illusion of legitimacy? The women who wore those halters bought their freedom for a few shillings, and the cost of their dignity, their courage, in the face of an impossible situation, deserves more than historical curiosity. It demands our commitment to ensuring that such degrading choices never again become necessary. For anyone seeking escape from intolerable circumstances, in their memory lies both warning and hope. Warning that progress can be reversed, and hope that understanding the past can help us build a more just future, where human dignity is never for sale in any marketplace, literal or metaphorical.